about shop motors, let's see what we're working on in the shop today. Today we're going to take a dive into Stewart Warner Ensign 5 gauge cluster that we assembled from parts we got at different swap meets. So let's take a look at the latest swap meet find that I have to share with you. So we're going to look at a Stewart Warner straight 5 panel. So as you can see, this probably isn't the nicest Stewart Warner panel you're ever going to come across. And I bought it because I really like the authentic panels. I like the fact that this was the real deal. This was probably from, you know, any time frame from maybe the late 50s into the mid 60s or so. It's had a rough life. As you can tell, someone's taken a gas hacksaw and torched out a big old hole in the middle to put a bigger speedometer or tachometer in it, and that's all right. The price on it was not horrible. So you can buy off of eBay, you can buy one of these reproduction or aftermarket non-Stewart Warner for, you know, anywhere from 150 to a couple $100 for this panel, which is awesome, and for a lot of guys that's fantastic. Most of my stuff I try to keep it with the real deal, the stuff with the sole. That's just what yanks my cord. If others want a version of it that's a new reproduction, that's fantastic. There's one out there. I'll walk you through kind of how I put together a panel out of pieces and swap meet finds to fit a kind of as found hot rod, and let's take a look. So got this panel, got a decent price on it, not horrible, and brought it up, cleaned it up a little bit. The chrome is pretty much gone off of it. It's had either been blasted or been polished to death, so not much chrome left on it. I can show you one that would have a little more chrome. So this is a straight 5 panel that is an original. It has decent chrome on it. It's pretty shiny. This is more or less what they would have looked like when they were new, and it's fantastic if you can find them like that. You're going to spend a little bit more money. People like the original chrome, but it's still a real deal panel, non-aftermarket. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what that once was in a previous life. So I get this panel, and I'm thinking, how can I use this piece to put together a whole panel? So in my pile of pieces, I ended up buying one of these panels that had 2 of these in it. So this is a separator plate that goes in between the gauges. You can see the back of it's pretty crusty. They would have had probably brass coated on one side and then some kind of cool surface on the other side. This piece has long lost its cool from a surface perspective. I cleaned it up a little bit, but it kind of is what it is. So it's a little rusty, a little crusty, and it's going to fit this gauge panel just fine. So I donated this to the cause. I end up now with at least a panel and an insert that kind of suit my needs, and we'll start to work. So I find this. I have some other gauges that I thought I might be able to use. I came across a really cool speedometer. It is a Stewart Warner 160, very desirable. This is a really cool speedometer. This particular one is, you know, it's seen better days. It's pretty yellowed. The needle has lost its paint off of it. I could absolutely pull the lens off of it. I can show you how to do that in a subsequent video, and I could clean it up. It's never going to be bright white again, and but we can re-white the needle and make sure it's nice and clean, and it would be awesome. So let's take a look at what some of the gauges might look like. So I have some gauges set aside for it. They're Stewart Warner gauges as well. We'll pull a mechanical temp gauge, a mechanical oil pressure, a fuel gauge, and an amp gauge. These are gauges that I've accumulated at swap meets over time. I didn't buy all of them at one time. I kind of just pick them up when I come across them. Most of the time you're probably going to spend, you know, 25 to 35 bucks a piece on a gauge. Sometimes if you're really desperate and you're in a hurry or impatient, which we all get when we're doing a hot rod, you could spend 100 or 150 off of some bidding sites. But part of the fun of this hobby is the hunt. So these are some of the ones I've hunted up. So let's kind of put these pieces together, and I'll walk you through what's involved in the pieces I found, and we'll assemble an old kind of as found gauge panel. So we'll take this super cool yellowed Stuart Warner speedometer. These old mechanical speedometers are pretty dependable, pretty straightforward. If they don't work, you can usually get them lubed up and freed up pretty easy. This one's super stiff, so as you can see, the needle's starting to bounce a little bit with when I turn it. A little bit of WD-40 or PB Blaster on the back and some movement and a drill motor, and it'll come right back to life. So we'll slide that in. We'll flip it over. And this is where you can see the fact that this particular panel has had so much damage to the back where they've torched it out. It really does kind of move around a lot, but once it's all bolted together, it's going to be fine. And you're not going to see any of it. This is going to get sandwiched with a dash in between it. So in the end, it's all fantastic and a super cool piece. So we'll kind of leave it there. We won't tighten it up too much yet because we got to put some other gauges in, and we'll definitely want to get that all centered. So that's the first piece. I typically, everybody kind of has their own preference. It's a mix of this era of gauges. For this panel, I would love to use all indirect lighted gauges like this particular one, where there's a plastic component that runs across the side of the gauge. It's probably an early 60s gauge. It's a brass can. I like it if all the gauges go together that I'm using in this set. I don't have one like that for the fuel gauge. The fuel gauge is a little bit later, probably a 70s vintage, and it has a light that goes in the back. It's just the nature of the beast when you're putting together a version like this. It's probably what you would run across at a swap meet. The style of the needle is different because this is a mechanical gauge. It has a pointed needle. This is an electric gauge. It has a square-ended needle. That's how it's going to be. So you're going to see two different styles on this gauge set. So we'll put together the fuel one in the outside. Because the holes on the outside haven't been cut up, it's going to allow that panel to get centered right where it's going to need to go. There's typically a detent for that gauge to fall into. That makes it face right the way it needs to. Then we'll take a look at the other gauge that we'll put on the other side, which is the amp gauge. It's a Stuart Warner gauge. It does not say SW on it. It doesn't have the block letters on it. They made this. It could have been in a number of other vehicles. They sold them to Kenworth and White and other companies that produce vehicles, and they went into their clusters. So it is a Stuart Warner gauge. If I find one that is a Stuart Warner block letter amp gauge, I can replace it, but for this use we're going to use this one. So this gauge would typically have insulators on this little panel here that I'm locking it down, because these are not just the mounting bolts for this gauge, they are also the terminals for the electric. So you would ultimately want to insulate those posts from this bracket. But for what we're doing, it's going to be fine, and we'll kind of give you the look and feel for. So if we were putting this in a car and we wanted to put this in, we would insulate this bracket from these posts before we did it. So now you see we balance the two square needles on the outsides. The next one is we have an equally yellowed and faded oil pressure gauge, which quite honestly, this would be the patina, and I know that word gets used a lot, but this would be the aged look that I would probably go for this set. It fits the panel. It's a mechanical gauge, so you put a tubing on here that runs to the motor, picks up the oil pressure, no sending unit, no electronics involved in this, so it fits my style perfectly. On this particular gauge, because it's mechanical, meaning it actually senses how much pressure the oil line has, it doesn't matter if this is metal on metal, because it isn't depending on electrical current to have a sender give it a impedance of any kind. So then we add the last gauge, which is a mechanical water temperature. This is a pretty cool gauge. I've taken it apart, as you can see back here. I've decrimped it and then recrimped it. I've cleaned out the inside. It was had some issues, or I think I replaced this blue shield that is where the light comes in to give it the right color. It's a gauge that was built out of multiple gauges, and as long as the capillary tube was good, it's pretty easy to keep them alive. It's been put back together and I tested it and the temperature's right. The temperature gauges are the hardest to find of these old gauges that are in good working order. Again, a mechanical gauge. This piece screws into a fitting that goes in the intake manifold typically, and senses the actual temperature of the water. So pretty trouble-free, pretty straightforward. Again, fits a lot of the hot rods I'm working on and kind of my approach to this hobby in general. Just like the oil pressure gauge, it doesn't matter if it's metal on metal as you button it up, because it doesn't care if the bracket is actually touching the case of the brass can. As you can see from the back, the panel's pretty much back together. All the pieces that you would want to have together to make a panel is there. This one had lighting that fell in these sockets that shine some light through these slots for these types of gauges, so it was really made for these early gauges. The speedometer uses a bulb that goes in the back, sort of like the same thought and principle as the fuel gauge. So it would have, if this were going in a hot rod just as it sits, it would have a couple different light sources, but overall it's a pretty cool piece. There you have a really neat panel done very affordably. It allows you to keep your hot rod project moving. It's super cool. You'd have all kinds of people saying, wow, that's a neat panel. You could spend 5 times as much and have a much more sophisticated or nicer quality one. You don't have to spend cubic dollars to have fun in this hot rod hobby. This is a great example of it. So thank you so much from Chop Shop Motor, and we'll see you on the next project.